Before we begin today's story, I need to acknowledge this is different from our usual content. This is not about weapons or tactics or engineering marvels. This is about a war crime that affected hundreds of thousands of women, about suffering the world tried to forget, about survivors who fought for 50 years to be heard, about justice still not fully achieved. If you value historical truth, if you believe survivors deserve recognition, if you think accountability matters even decades later, subscribe to War Rewind right now. This story needs to be told. These voices need to be heard. Hit that subscribe button. Now let's talk about the women the world forgot. 1945, August. The war in the Pacific was ending. Japan had surrendered. Allied forces began occupying Japanese-controlled territories. American soldiers, British forces, Chinese troops, Australian units, Soviet forces, all moving into areas Japan had controlled for years. And they found something the Japanese military had tried to hide, something documented but not widely known, something that would remain largely forgotten for nearly 50 years. They found women, tens of thousands of women, in buildings near military installations, in occupied territories across Asia, Korea, China, Philippines, Indonesia, Burma, Malaysia, scattered across the Japanese Empire. Women who'd been taken from their homes, held in what the Japanese military called comfort stations, a bureaucratic euphemism hiding a brutal reality. The American soldiers who found these stations were shocked, not by the existence of wartime sexual violence. That happened in every war, they knew that, but by the scale, by the organization, by the paperwork. This wasn't random violence by individual soldiers. This was systematic, organized by the military itself, documented, regulated, a system. Estimates vary. The exact numbers may never be known, but historians believe approximately 200,000 women were forced into this system, mostly Korean, perhaps 80%, but also Chinese, Filipino, Indonesian, Dutch, women from across occupied Asia, some as young as 14 or 15 years old, taken from their homes, told they'd work in factories or hospitals or restaurants, promised legitimate employment, then transported to stations near military bases, trapped there, unable to leave. The Japanese military had created what they officially called the comfort system, established in 1932, expanded throughout the 1930s and 40s as Japan's empire grew. Stations opened wherever Japanese forces were stationed. The military controlled everything: location of stations, transportation of women to stations, medical inspections, regulations, all documented, all organized. A military operation with paperwork and procedures. When Allied forces found these stations in 1945, they documented what they saw, interviewed some women, took photographs, filed reports. The evidence existed, but very little was done with it. The Tokyo war crimes trials mentioned comfort women. Briefly, a few Japanese officers were prosecuted, but the system itself wasn't made a central focus. Other atrocities received more attention. The comfort system was noted, then largely set aside. The women themselves faced a difficult situation. Many couldn't go home. The shame in their communities would be overwhelming. Traditional societies, honor-based cultures. Being forced into sexual servitude meant being unmarriageable, unwelcome. Many stayed in the countries where they'd been taken, tried to build new lives, never spoke about what happened, kept silent because speaking meant reliving trauma, meant facing judgment, meant risking rejection by families and communities. For 46 years, most of the world didn't think about the comfort women. The Cold War dominated international attention. Japan became a crucial American ally. Economic reconstruction took priority. War crimes discussions faded. The women who'd survived stayed silent, tried to forget, tried to move forward with their lives, carried the weight alone. But silence has its limits. Truth has a way of emerging. And in 1991, something changed. One woman decided silence was worse than speaking, decided the world needed to know, decided her dignity mattered more than shame. Her name was Kim Hak-soon, South Korea, 67 years old in 1991. For nearly 50 years, she'd kept silent about what happened to her during the war. She'd been 17 when Japanese recruiters came to her village, told her she could work in a factory, help support her family. She believed them, went with them, found herself transported to a comfort station in China, trapped there for years until the war ended. After the war, Kim Hak-soon returned to Korea. Never married, never had children, never spoke about the comfort stations. The stigma was too great. She lived quietly, worked, tried to forget, but she couldn't forget. The memories stayed, the injustice stayed, the knowledge that what happened had never been properly acknowledged, that the women had been forgotten. In August 1991, Kim Hak-soon did something extraordinary. She came forward publicly, held a press conference, told her story, used her real name, her real face, spoke openly about being forced into the comfort system, about the years of suffering, about returning home to silence and shame, about waiting nearly 50 years for acknowledgement that never came. She was the first former comfort woman to speak publicly, using her real identity, and her courage broke the dam. Within weeks, other survivors in Korea came forward. Women who'd stayed silent for decades, who'd carried the weight alone, who'd thought they were isolated. Now they realized they weren't alone. Dozens came forward. Then more. Then more. They formed organizations, support groups. They began meeting, sharing stories, realizing the scope of what had happened. They'd each thought their experience was unique, individual. Now they understood it had been systematic, organized, hundreds of thousands of women. A system that operated for over a decade across an entire empire. And they decided they wanted justice, not revenge. Justice, recognition, a formal apology from the Japanese government, acknowledgement of what had been done, compensation for the years stolen from them, the trauma they'd carried, the lives disrupted. They wanted Japan to teach this history in schools, to ensure future generations knew what happened, to prevent such systems from ever existing again. The survivors began demonstrating. Every Wednesday, starting in 1992, in front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul, they gathered, held signs, demanded acknowledgement. They called it the Wednesday demonstration, and they kept doing it, week after week, month after month, year after year. As of 2024, the Wednesday demonstration has continued for over 1,500 consecutive weeks, over 30 years. Some of the original demonstrators have died, others continue. New supporters join them, but the demonstration continues, every Wednesday, demanding justice. The Japanese government's response was complicated. Initial reactions were denials, claims that the comfort system hadn't existed, or if it had existed, the military wasn't directly involved, that women had been recruited by private contractors, that the military had no responsibility. These denials infuriated survivors. The documentation existed. Military records existed. Survivors existed. Denial was adding insult to injury. Under pressure, the Japanese government began investigating. In 1992, Japanese historian Yoshimi Yoshiaki found military documents in Japan's National Institute for Defense Studies. Documents proving military involvement. Orders about establishing comfort stations, regulations, transportation arrangements. The paperwork was clear. The military had organized and controlled the system. In 1993, Japan issued what became known as the Kono Statement. Chief Cabinet Secretary Yohei Kono acknowledged that comfort stations had existed, that the Japanese military had been involved in establishing and managing them, that women had been recruited against their will, that the military had participated in recruitment in many cases, that coercion was widespread. The statement expressed apologies and remorse. The Kono statement was significant. It was official acknowledgement, but for many survivors, it wasn't enough. The apology wasn't from the Prime Minister directly. It didn't include specific compensation, and subsequent Japanese officials occasionally made statements that seemed to walk back or qualify the Kono statement. This pattern frustrated survivors and their advocates. Official acknowledgement seemed unstable, subject to political changes. In 2015, Japan and South Korea negotiated an agreement. Japan would provide 1 billion yen, approximately $8 million, to a foundation supporting surviving comfort women. In exchange, South Korea would consider the matter resolved. The agreement was controversial. Many survivors rejected it. They hadn't been consulted. The money came from the government to a foundation, not direct compensation to individuals. The word for the payment wasn't compensation. It was described as healing money. The distinction mattered to many survivors. They wanted acknowledgement of legal responsibility, not charity. Some survivors accepted support from the foundation. Others refused. The movement fractured somewhat over the agreement, but many survivors continued demanding more. They wanted education. They wanted Japanese textbooks to accurately describe the comfort system. They wanted future Japanese leaders to maintain acknowledgement, not walk it back based on political convenience. They wanted the truth permanently established. The comfort women issue became international. Memorials were erected. The first statue of a comfort woman was unveiled in Seoul in 2011. A bronze figure of a young woman sitting, face serious, determined, representing all the survivors. The statue became iconic. Replicas were installed in other locations. San Francisco erected one in 2017. Japan protested. Osaka ended its sister city relationship with San Francisco over the statue. Berlin installed one. Manila, Sydney, Glendale, California. The statues became physical manifestations of the demand for recognition. Each statue sparked diplomatic tension. Japan's government consistently opposed them, argued they damaged relations, requested removal. But the statues remained. For supporters, removing them would mean erasing the survivors' stories, giving in to pressure to forget. The statues represented refusing to forget, insisting that history be remembered, that survivors be honored. As years passed, survivors aged. Many died without seeing full justice. Of the women who came forward in the 1990s, most have passed away. As of 2024, very few surviving comfort women remain alive. Those still living are in their 90s or older. Time is running out. The urgency increases every year. The window for survivors to receive acknowledgement while living closes. The surviving comfort women who remain continue fighting. They participate in demonstrations when able, give interviews, tell their stories to young people, visit schools. They've become educators, teaching history the way they believe it should be taught, from the perspective of those who lived it, who survived it, who carry the memories. The movement evolved beyond just Korean survivors. Chinese survivors came forward, Filipino survivors, Indonesian survivors, Dutch women who'd been interned in Indonesia, women from across Asia. Each country's survivors faced similar challenges, stigma in their communities, governments that didn't prioritize their demands, indifference from societies that wanted to move past wartime history. But they found common cause, international solidarity among survivors. Research continued. Historians investigated. More documents emerged. Military orders, transportation records, medical inspection logs, station regulations. The paper trail was extensive. The system's scope became clearer. Not just the comfort stations themselves, but the military's active role in every aspect: establishment, operation, regulation, transportation, medical supervision, everything. Some Japanese veterans confessed, spoke publicly about their involvement or knowledge of comfort stations. These testimonies added detail, personal accounts confirming what documents showed. The confessions were difficult for Japan, veterans admitting to actions that contradicted official narratives. That complicated efforts to downplay military responsibility. Educational efforts expanded. Activists pushed for accurate teaching of the comfort system in schools, not just in Korea, but internationally. The argument was that this history shouldn't be hidden, that students should learn about systematic wartime sexual violence, that understanding prevents repetition, that silence enables forgetting, that forgetting enables denial, that denial prevents accountability. Japan's textbook controversies became flashpoints. Some Japanese textbooks included sections on comfort women, described the system, acknowledged military involvement. But political pressure led to revisions. Some descriptions were softened, made less direct about responsibility, changed from forced to words suggesting more ambiguity about coercion. Each revision sparked protests from survivors and advocates. The survivors emphasized they weren't seeking vengeance against Japanese people. They distinguished between the military system that victimized them and the Japanese citizens who bore no responsibility. They wanted accountability from the government and military structures, not blame on ordinary Japanese people. Many survivors expressed this explicitly. They harbored no hatred toward Japan as a nation, just toward the system that had abused them and the ongoing refusal to fully acknowledge it. International human rights organizations became involved. The United Nations addressed the issue. Multiple reports, recommendations to Japan, calls for formal legal recognition of responsibility, compensation, education. The comfort women issue became a human rights question, not just a historical matter. The treatment of survivors and acknowledgement of what happened became measures of how societies handle historical injustice. The legal situation remained complex. Some survivors attempted lawsuits against the Japanese government, seeking compensation. Most lawsuits failed. Japanese courts generally ruled that wartime actions were covered by peace treaties and statute of limitations. International legal remedies proved difficult. The survivors faced a frustrating reality. Moral acknowledgement didn't translate to legal liability. Historical recognition didn't mean enforceable compensation. Yet the survivors persisted. The Wednesday demonstrations continued. The statues remained. New generations became aware of the history. Young activists joined the movement. High school students, university students, people too young to remember the war, but committed to ensuring its lessons weren't forgotten. The movement became intergenerational. The survivors' fight became a broader social justice movement. Digital age helped spread the story. Documentaries were made, films, books translated into multiple languages. Social media allowed survivors to reach global audiences. The comfort women issue gained international recognition in ways impossible before the internet. Young people worldwide learned the history, connected it to contemporary discussions about sexual violence, about systematic abuse, about structures that enable harm. The Me Too movement in 2017 created new connections. Survivors of sexual violence speaking publicly, demanding accountability, refusing shame. The comfort women's decades-long fight for recognition resonated with contemporary movements. The parallels were clear. Victims blamed, perpetrators protected, institutions covering up systematic abuse. The comfort women survivors became symbols of resistance, of refusing to stay silent, of demanding justice regardless of time elapsed. Some Japanese citizens supported the survivors. Japanese activists, historians, teachers, ordinary citizens who believed their government should acknowledge historical truth, who felt embarrassed by official denials or equivocation, who wanted Japan to face its history honestly. This internal Japanese support mattered to survivors. It showed the issue wasn't nation against nation. It was about truth and justice. The movement's demands remained consistent across decades: official acknowledgement of military responsibility, direct apology from Japan's government, legal recognition in Japanese law, compensation directly to survivors, education in Japanese schools, accurate textbook descriptions, public memorials in Japan itself. These weren't demands for revenge. They were demands for truth, recognition, dignity. As survivors died, some with their demands unmet, the urgency intensified. Each death represented a lost opportunity, a voice silenced before full justice. Advocates emphasized time's cruelty, that waiting for political convenience meant survivors dying without acknowledgement, that delayed justice is denied justice, that international politics shouldn't override survivors' dignity. The comfort women issue revealed broader questions. How do societies handle historical atrocities? When is accountability achieved? What does meaningful apology require? How much detail should be taught to young people? How do you balance diplomatic relations against historical truth? How do you weigh survivors' demands against political pragmatism? These questions have no easy answers. Different people answer differently, but the survivors have been clear about what they want. They want the truth told, without euphemisms, without minimizing. They want responsibility acknowledged clearly, unambiguously. They want Japan to teach this history to its children, so future generations understand what happened. They want memorials, physical reminders that can't be erased. They want compensation, not as charity, as acknowledgement of harm done. They want apologies, direct, from the highest levels. They want respect, dignity, recognition of their humanity. Some progress has been made. More awareness now than in 1991. The story is known internationally. Taught in many countries, memorials exist. Organizations support survivors. Historical research continues. But from the survivor's perspective, full justice hasn't been achieved. Official acknowledgement remains unstable, subject to political shifts. Education incomplete, compensation inadequate, legal responsibility not fully accepted, and time is almost out. Of the 200,000 estimated women forced into the comfort system, almost all are dead. Of those who came forward in the 1990s, most have died. Maybe a dozen or fewer remain alive as of 2024. When the last survivor dies, something fundamental changes. The demands continue, but without living voices. Justice delayed, the surviving women who remain physically able still attend Wednesday demonstrations. Elderly, frail, but determined. They've been demanding justice for over 30 years. Some have been coming since 1992. 32 years of Wednesdays. Over 1,500 demonstrations. They won't stop now. They can't stop. For themselves and for those who've already died. For the 200,000 who never got to speak. For the memory that must not be forgotten. The younger generation in Korea and beyond has taken up the cause. Understanding this isn't just historical. It's about how societies treat survivors of sexual violence today. How they acknowledge systematic abuse. How they balance political convenience against moral obligation. The comfort women's fight became larger than themselves. It became about principles, about insisting that power acknowledge harm, that time doesn't erase responsibility, that survivors deserve to be heard. This is their story, not just the suffering, that's been told, but the resistance, the courage to speak after 46 years of silence. The determination to demand justice for over 30 years. The refusal to be forgotten. The insistence on dignity. The fight that continues even as the survivors age and die. The movement that has outlasted most of those who started it. The weekly demonstrations that never stopped. The statues that stand as permanent witnesses. The young people who carry the memory forward. 200,000 women, mostly young, taken from their homes, promised work, trapped in a system designed by military bureaucrats, used and discarded, then forgotten for nearly 50 years, until one woman decided silence was worse than shame, until Kim Hak-soon spoke, until others followed, until they demanded the world remember, until they refused to let history erase them. The war ended in 1945. The survivors started speaking in 1991. They've been demanding justice since 1992. As of 2024, they're still waiting, still demonstrating, still telling their stories, still insisting they matter, still fighting to be remembered, not as victims who stayed silent, but as survivors who refused to be forgotten. 1945. American soldiers found comfort stations across occupied Asia. Women held by the Japanese military. Systematic, organized, documented. Approximately 200,000 women over 13 years. The world noticed briefly, then forgot, moved on. Cold War, economic reconstruction. The women stayed silent, stigmatized, ashamed, trying to rebuild lives. 46 years passed. 1991. Kim Hak-soon came forward, 67 years old, told her story publicly, used her real name. First survivor to break silence. Over 1,500 consecutive Wednesday demonstrations. Over 30 years. Some original demonstrators have died. Others continue. The demonstration never stopped. Japan's response complicated. Initial denials. Then acknowledgement in 1993, Kono's statement. But subsequent statements walked back commitment. 2015 agreement controversial. Many survivors rejected it. Statues erected, Seoul, San Francisco, Berlin, Manila. Physical memorials. Japan protests them. Diplomatic tensions. But statues remain, refusing to forget. Survivors aging. Most have died, maybe a dozen left alive. In their 90s, time running out. They keep fighting, for themselves, for those already dead, for the 200,000 who never spoke. They want truth told, without euphemisms, responsibility acknowledged, education in Japanese schools, memorials, compensation, apologies, dignity. This story is different from our usual content. No weapons, no tactics, no engineering marvels. This is about suffering, about silence, about courage to speak, about fighting for justice for over 30 years. If you believe survivors deserve recognition, if you think accountability matters, if you value historical truth even when it's uncomfortable, subscribe to War Rewind right now. Hit that subscribe button. These stories need to be told. These voices need to be heard. Drop a like if you believe the comfort women's fight for justice matters.